relationship with you on high-speed transportation discussions between Dallas, Fort Worth, Waco, Killeen-Temple, Austin, San Antonio, and Laredo. Some of you may have been involved in the study that we all worked on together back in 2018, 2019, 2020. We were lucky enough to finish that study in 2020 before the pandemic hit us. So we've been kind of, pardon the pun, derailed for a couple of years as we try to advance high-speed transportation through north to central down to South Texas. But that doesn't mean we, as the North Central Texas Council of Governments, haven't been busy trying to continue momentum with not only high-speed rail, but other new and emerging technologies within the state. So we have been working diligently over a couple of years to try to advance, and we're going to update you today. First, I'm going to remind you of where we ended up, because I don't think we were ever able to come to you and talk to you at the end of the study in 2020. So I'll give you a very, very quick update on where we ended up. Brendon will kind of tell you the final alternative where we are, and then introduce a program that we started with our policy board, the Regional Transportation Council for the Dallas-Fort Worth MPO last year regarding advancing new technologies. And then, as you mentioned, we'll have one of those new technologies that's in our program tell you about an exciting opportunity. I think that's available to all of us. So, moving on quickly, I mentioned the study. This is the study that was done in 2020. All those names should look familiar to you. So we had, as a Council of Governments, had hired consultants to do a lot of this work. What we wanted to do was pick up where TxDOT and Oklahoma had left off with the Toppers high-speed rail study that they did previous to 2020. We were only picking it up from Dallas-Fort Worth through Texas down to Laredo. If you were involved in that study, you'll remember that what TxDOT did was created a Tier 1 federal environmental document, which means they looked at general alignments, but didn't get into a specific alignment. What we wanted to do with your help and with our consultants was carry that to the next level and identify a specific alignment that would then be used as consideration in a formal federal environmental document. So and I kind of covered a lot of this already. The bottom line is potential station locations and alignments for future federal environmental documents. These are all the locations that we had discussed. We had 23 different, I would call them virtual alignments that we could choose from. And they ranged all the way from greenfield to highway corridors to railroad corridors and other utility corridors. And we put together about every combination we could think of to at least try to analyze. You can see a lot of those there. Now, certain technologies, whether it be conventional rail, high-speed rail, maglev, Hyperloop, new technology, which you'll hear about today, certain technologies are more suitable for certain alignments. So it's kind of a challenge because we're dealing with different types of technologies and different alignments. And we have to kind of settle on one alignment, one technology to move forward with. So these are the technologies that I've mentioned. Guaranteed transit, that was a pseudonym for us because we have a lot of express toll managed lanes in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We use those as guaranteed transit corridors where we can run rubber-tired vehicles on those buses and have the same type of reliability that you have with, say, a rail system, right? Because reliability is really the hallmark of public transportation when it comes to rail. But not everybody between Dallas-Fort Worth and Laredo has toll express managed lanes. So there were certain corridors that could be used for that and certain ones that couldn't. Where we ended up was really in the higher speed, high speed, maglev, and Hyperloop side of things that everybody seemed to be interested in. So once we knew that and we kind of knew narrow down the alignments. We're then able to move forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Brendon, who's now going to kind of tell you where we ended up, the final recommendation from that study, and then introduce the next part of this discussion, which is this technology program that we've been working with. Brendon? Thanks, Dan.
So as Dan outlined, we had this screening analysis of paired alignments with these different high-speed technologies. And this is in a nutshell really where we ended up, following basically a utility corridor from Fort Worth just south of Waco, using the 35, again, general corridor where we talk about an alignment. It's not, very fine pencil on a piece of paper. It's still kind of a fat line where it needs to be refined. But generally along 35 through Killeen-Temple, Austin to San Antonio, and then more or less following a greenfield down to Laredo. Hyperloop in all of its paired corridors really scored higher in the study based on all the criteria that was analyzed, and we won't go into all those today, but the study documents go further into detail on what that were. High-speed rail and maglev also did rank highly, but as we all know, the sheer distance between all these metro areas really necessitates a need for something higher speed. So the faster you go, the better it's going to score. The faster you go, the more straight line you need to be able to go that fast. So that's why this alignment came through as a result of the study with the stops in all the cities that you see here. So as Dan alluded to, we have our Regional Transportation Council created a new program here just a couple of years ago. We call it the CERT program, which stands for Certification of Emerging and Reliable Transportation Technology. This is really on the heels of seeing how Hyperloop and even other transportation technologies, a couple of them pictured here, gondola style technologies in urban areas, are really trying to get to the next level to actually be operational in a real world revenue generating environment. In order to do that, they have to be certified for safety and operational standards. They have to fit under a regulatory environment. They fit under the motor vehicle department. They fit under the Federal Transit Administration, Federal Railroad. They have to have a structure where they're able to report their safety and operational standards to and be able to adhere to it if they're going to be moving the public. So from that standpoint, we developed this program to provide an opportunity for these new technology providers to come to the DFW region and to potentially partner with local governments in the DFW region. So our North Central Texas Council of Governments has over 200 local governments as a part of its organization. And so the RTC requested that we provide a level playing field for all those local governments to be able to provide locations if they're interested of, hey, maybe this city or this community wants to host a new technology and host their facility within their boundaries and their jurisdiction. But what they get in return is they would actually get a brand new technology that's able to operate and meet a transportation need. So these aren't facilities that will be scrapped once the certification's over. These are actually facilities that can be turned over and actually used for operations once they're in place. And for Hyperloop, Zach will cover this here in a second, but for Hyperloop, that may be 10, 15 miles. For some of these other facilities, maybe a couple miles. But that was the concept behind creating this program. Through that program, TransPod did submit. They were successfully progressed through that program. We have a lot of interest in our region to be able to host this. But really the next step is if they're going to locate a certification facility somewhere in DFW or anywhere else, it really needs to be a part of their intercity network. So that's really the next step. Where is this intercity line going? Kind of building on the backs of the study that Dan just talked about. So with that, let me turn it over to Zach. Can you hear it, Zach?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. If you can proceed with the slides, feel free to. If not, just let me know when and I'll advance this.
Sounds good. Yeah, I don't think I have the power to move the slides forward, but so I'll just sort of ask you if that's okay. So yeah, hi, nice to meet you all. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I'm in France right now, so it's a little bit far to get over there. So I'll start by just giving you a bit of an overview of TransPod and who we are and what we're building, and then what our goals are for Texas and how we'd like to get there. So as you can see on the slide in front of you and on the picture on the right, TransPod is developing a type of Hyperloop technology. Hyperloop in a nutshell is a train-like vehicle that travels through a tube. The tube has been depressurized, so there's low or no air pressure, and the vehicle is levitating. And so because of that, there's no aerodynamic friction and there's no friction between the wheels and the ground. And so you're able to achieve really high speeds of around 600 miles an hour. It's a fully electric mode of transport, and we are in the process of developing it right now. So we have our first prototype that's fully functional in Toronto, and we're also in the process of developing some commercial corridors, one in Alberta, Canada, and then a few others that are at a bit of an earlier stage elsewhere around the world. Can you go to the next slide, please, Brendon? So just a bit of a detailed overview of what we're building. So as I mentioned, it needs to be levitating in order to get that higher speed. So we have basically electromagnets on the top of the vehicle, as you can see in that image. Those pull the vehicle up by being attracted to the tube being metal. And then we also have electromagnets on the bottom where we put an electric current through those magnets. The electric current creates a wave, and that creates propulsion. And then finally, there's the power transmission. We need to get power onto the vehicle somehow. So that's our third big innovation. We're basically arcing plasma. So plasma is it's that fourth state of matter. If you remember your high school science classes, it's the northern lights. Basically, we're harnessing that to, in a contactless way, put power onto the vehicle. Next slide, please. And then the infrastructure is really similar to what you would expect in railway infrastructure, except for the fact that it's in a tube. But we have stations where you have multiple parallel, boarding and disembarking platforms, just like a train station. Then you have the multiple platforms which converge into one or two lines, and the vehicle will go through an airlock to get into that low pressure zone. And then once it's in the low pressure zone, it can achieve those really high speeds of, as I mentioned, around 600 miles per hour. Next slide, please. So what we're hoping to do in Texas, as has already been touched on by Brendon and Dan, is build one of our first long distance lines. So I mentioned we already have one that's in the works in Alberta, Canada. That one's about 200 miles. The one that we're hoping to build ultimately in Texas would be much longer than that, and obviously much more ambitious. There's a lot more cities and a lot more population that we'd be impacting there. So the preliminary plan is to connect basically from DFW down to Laredo through all of the key population centers that sort of form that straight line, pretty much exactly aligning with the study that the North Central Texas Council of Governments has already conducted in 2020. In order to get there, we basically would take a phased approach. So we would start with a a shorter distance line of around 10 to 50 miles. And that would just be a certification facility. So that would be so that the Texas Department of Transport and the Federal Railway Association could come to that facility and see us running tests and running operations for about a year with maybe no passengers or cargo. And basically verify that it's safe. And once we have that certification from those authorities, we would then go into extending the line throughout Texas. So we wouldn't scrap the certification line as was mentioned, but we would actually just extend that line into this full long distance line. And so that's why the shorter track needs to be somewhere along the ultimate long-term corridor. And then once we have finished up with that full Texas connection, as you can see, we have actually some longer term plans. I would say that's getting past 2030, maybe more towards 2035 or 2040, which is to possibly do the full Texas triangle. So head east towards Houston or connect Dallas, Houston, and also possibly head into Monterey and up north to Oklahoma. So those are, that's our really long-term plan. But in the shorter term, really the goal is to build a test facility in Texas and use that to get certification from the U.S. authorities. So the first step, sorry, can you go to the next slide, please? The first step would be to do a feasibility study. So we would basically need to add on to the feasibility study that the North Central Texas Council conducted a few years ago to get some more specific information about our system and make sure that it would be viable. So we would want to do a study where we're determining the financial viability of our specific system, not just a general Hyperloop line. Look at the route options that were selected in the previous study and basically make sure that they align well to, to our criteria and our specifications. Determine the economic and socioeconomic impacts that the line would have, so basically how that would benefit Texas. And same with the environmental impacts. Verify that it's constructible, and then go through an implementation plan. And assuming that the study is positive, which I would hope it will be, we would then go actually and start the implementation. And all of this, it would probably take about 6 months. We did a similar one in Alberta, and it was about a 6-month process overall. And in that case, it did turn out to be a positive result for the feasibility study. And so we were then able to go and get a financing proposal so that it could be fully privately financed and start basically the preliminary works. So next slide, please. So overall, the high-level timeline would be to do that feasibility study in the first year, and then go through the construction and testing for about 2 years of construction and 2 years of testing and certification, so that by 2028 we're able to have that first segment fully operational and start extending between all of the other cities in Texas. And then by about 2030 to 2032, we would aim to have the full corridor operational. So it feels pretty long term, but at the same time, it's quite busy. There's lots to do in between now and then. So a pretty aggressive timeline nonetheless. Next slide, please. I wanted to quickly touch on some of the impacts that this would have. So obviously, we would get more detail on this as we're conducting the feasibility study, but we can already know some of these from the studies that we've done in the past. So at a high level, since it's fully electric and since the corridor is so long distance, we would be replacing lots of car and plane trips with an electric form of transport. So it would have a big impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And actually, we've done, I would say, about a 1 or 2 day analysis just to get some high level numbers. And it seems like there would be about 500,000 tons of CO2 emissions avoided each year. So a really big positive environmental impact. Likewise, big multi-billion-dollar economic impact. So the total project cost would probably be above $20 billion, and that would be fully privately financed. So that wouldn't be requested from any of the MPOs or from the state or federal governments. That would be private investment coming into the state and creating jobs and economic output in the state. And at the same time, obviously it's the transportation system, so we create lots of travel time benefits and some other positive benefits as well, but I won't go through all of them. So one more slide, please, and then that's it for me. So what we were hoping to ask, basically the support that we have in mind in order to help us get there. As you know, we've already been working with Brendon and Dan and the folks in North Central Texas for the past few years. And the next step in order to get to being able to kick off that feasibility study is to get the Texas Department of Transport on board to basically just be supportive of our project. We don't need their financial support, but we just need them to basically say that they're interested in TransPod coming to the state. And if the study is successful, they would be interested in TransPod building our project, because without that, we can't convince our investors that it's worth our time and worth our investment to begin studying Texas. So what we really would request is support all like Killeen-Temple, North Central Texas, TransPod, working together to convince the state government of the merit of this. And then if we get to that point of doing a feasibility study, it would be to support us if there's any transportation data or that sort of thing that we need. basically support us with the data and that sort of thing during the study. So it's not a really big ask. It's more just support and looping in on the process that North Central Texas has already started to try and get the Texas state government on board. Brendon, I think you've got another slide or two for next steps that you guys have in mind. So I'll leave it there, and then I'll be happy to take questions afterwards.
Thanks, Zach. I do just have one more slide here, and it reiterates a lot of what Zach mentioned, but going back to the very beginning of the presentation, the results of this Fort Worth to Laredo high-speed transportation study, all the MPOs, COG, we're all interested in taking this to the Texas Transportation Commission to advance that corridor and advance that environmental analysis. Dan mentioned Tier 1 was completed. To be able to actually go to construction on anything, you have to go through more of a Tier 2 environmental analysis where you're really looking at impacts, you're really zoning in on exactly where the corridor is, what it's displacing or impacting environmental concerns, social concerns, all that. And in order to do that, it really requires the state to have a more direct involvement. Unfortunately, based on the timing, early 2020, we weren't able to get that done. So we're proposing to refresh that effort, go back to the commission. In fact, just recently, a couple of weeks ago, our transportation director sent a letter to Mark Williams with TxDOT leadership, copied all the MPO directors along this corridor requesting, can we have an audience with the Texas Transportation Commission? Let's discuss how we can approach that, refreshing the results of this study and bringing this opportunity that TransPod is interested in our state, interested in performing a feasibility study on their own dime. Can we have some state support in moving forward? So that's really the path forward at this point. There's no commitment to costs or anything of that sort. There's always opportunities along the way to decision points where we can say, hey, this isn't looking like I thought it would. I'm not really interested in moving forward. At this point, it's really a feasibility study on TransPod's dime, just with the support of the MPO saying, we're interested in seeing where this is going. Let's wait and see what the feasibility study produces and make that decision at that time. But we do need to stay involved. So that's really the end of our presentation. Happy to take any questions y'all may have, either Dan or I or Zach.
If I can make just a couple other quick comments before we get to your questions. So one of the things you see up here, this last bullet here, this 10 to 50 mile test track could be anywhere in that segment that Zach outlined. So that's one of the things that the feasibility study will also look at is where best to put their test track. So just because we started the program doesn't mean we think it has to be in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. In fact, we looked in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and we're having trouble really finding a good location that would then be part of the final alignment. So, we're not by any means trying to say that the certification has to be Dallas-Fort Worth. It's really going to be TransPod's decision where it is based on whatever their feasibility study says. So, there's opportunities. It could be anywhere along that corridor. The other part I wanted to bring up is you may or may not have heard, I probably assume you had, Amtrak made an announcement last week regarding high-speed rail in Texas. They are essentially partnering with what is the Texas Central Partners high-speed rail corridor from Houston to Dallas. We have been working with Texas Central for years as they develop their corridor. Our goal is to have that also connect Dallas to Fort Worth. We are currently working on, within our region, we are paying for the environmental study of that between Dallas, Arlington, and Fort Worth. Right now, we had intended to go into the NEPA process, leaving the technology in open discussion. And then the two technologies we were looking at was high-speed rail and Hyperloop. The Federal Railroad Administration, Federal Transit Administration forced us to choose a technology. So they would not let us actually go with Hyperloop. So we are going into that study with high-speed rail to connect then with Houston to Dallas and then carry it over to Fort Worth. So as you saw in Zach's image, they're also interested in Dallas to Fort Worth. So depending on how the future rolls out, who the potential high-speed rail operator would be between Houston and Dallas, remains to be seen whether the Houston or Dallas will eventually be high-speed rail or it could be Hyperloop. It's our region's, it's our regional transportation council's hope that if it is high-speed rail, we have a one-seat ride between Fort Worth to Houston. If it's Hyperloop, we have a one-seat ride from Dallas to Laredo. So really the Dallas to Fort Worth piece could go either way. So right now, we're saying it's high-speed rail because we have to, but depending on what the eventual operator, who the eventual operator is and the feasibility studies that they would have to do, it could go either way. So Zach is proposing to include that as part of his feasibility study, but I don't want to, I just want to make sure we're not confusing people by TransPod doing the feasibility study that includes Dallas to Fort Worth down to Laredo, and we're working with Texas Central and Amtrak on Fort Worth to Dallas to Houston as high-speed rail. So I just wanted to get that out there. It doesn't really affect you that much, but there could be a lot of people that start talking about that. So
if I could add one thing that you mentioned, FRA didn't allow us to take Hyperloop in the NEPA process. The reason that was, just to clarify, is they don't have a certification facility, so FRA has nothing to check those operations against during that NEPA process. So FRA is saying, I don't know what your noise levels are going to be, I don't know what this or that's going to be, because I can't test that in a real world situation. So a little bit of a chicken and egg thing, so that's why creating a corridor of feasibility where you can actually build a certification facility will allow Hyperloop to advance. And this would be the first Hyperloop certification facility in the US if it was built along this corridor to advance this technology. There's several Hyperloop companies out there, but TransPod is the one who's approached us, and they actually have a very sophisticated approach in Canada as well. That's
So I have a question. You know, you mentioned the certification track needs to be part of that corridor or preferred. We have, much like Fort Worth and Dallas, we have Temple and Killeen. They're not as far apart, but they are far apart. But they run down 14. Is there a possibility, should we be selected for the certification, that it be part of 14 and feed into this main trunk line? Is that something that would be possible, or does it just have to be 10 to 50 miles of what's
yeah,
here?
so I'd like for Zach to answer part of that question, but let me kind of address it generally the way I understand what we're trying to accomplish here. Yes, we are looking at a very specific alignment here, but at some point, again, as part of the feasibility study that TransPod will be doing, I'm sure they would be happy to entertain something like that because you have I-14 that does it go all the way to Fort Cavazos right now?
It goes past a little past it.
So I can't imagine if it made feasibility sense to connect major U.S. military installation as a potential spur track. That's not that long, to be honest. I think it would make some sense to at least review it from a feasibility standpoint. That then could directly connect with the main trunk line that could go. So, Zach, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I was just looking actually as you were speaking, and it looks like to get out to Fort Cavazos from like kind of what I would describe the main line, like from Temple basically, it's about 20 miles. So that's actually plenty of distance for us to do the certification facility. And I'll just maybe clarify the reason why we said 10 to 50 miles is because the longer it is, obviously the higher speeds we can achieve. And so if it's 50 miles, we could get certified at top speed, you know, at 700, 600 miles per hour from the get-go. If the certification facility at first is only around 10 miles or 20 miles, that's fine too. We would just do a phased approach for certification. So get certified first at maybe 400 miles an hour, and then as we build more distance, get certified for faster speeds. So shorter distances are fine, and it looks like actually that I-14 is pretty nice and straight and has lots of open space, at least between Temple and Killeen. So it could be a great spot actually.
I could add, as you're thinking about that, to that point, this is the part where engineers kind of get excited talking about this. If it's 50 miles of curving, you're not going to get up to very high speed, but if it's 20 miles straight line, you could get some pretty good speed. So the distance and the tangents are important in that. Yes, sir.
And thank you for coming from sounding parochial, so I asked the same question. And with that, I think the opportunity is there as we try to expand 14 going towards, I guess, in the Houston direction eventually, and it works in your favor. But is your intent, is this mostly going to be above ground, elevated track, nothing street level?
So ultimately, it has to be grade separate.
Yeah.
You couldn't have vehicles going 200 to 600 miles per hour at grade.
You can't cross.
Wouldn't work. So it has to be grade separate. So whether it's above ground or whether it's below ground, really just depends on the economics of what's more feasible at that point. Sometimes the grade may favor you to be underground. Sometimes the grade may favor you to be above ground, right? Not a lot of grade in this part of Texas, but as we start getting a little further south, it starts to get a little more, there's a little more grade that comes into play. Just to give you an example of what we're dealing with in Dallas and Fort Worth, just between downtown Dallas and downtown Fort Worth, it's pretty flat. But when we're talking about vehicles going these speeds, you've got a maximum grade of 1% to 2%. That's not a lot. So for high-speed rail. So to try to change an elevation, you can't just go from above down into the end of a tunnel very quickly. It's a long transition. So all of that just comes down to the engineering of what the topography says, and frankly, what the other infrastructure that's in the way is. But all of that is something that TransPod will look at as they get into the feasibility study.
Geology also.
And geology, absolutely.
Sure.
Absolutely.
The second part of that is an existing structure, transportation, I heard you mention, because in a couple of the cities, you also have regional airports, so the possibility of intermodal connection.
Absolutely. And thank you for mentioning intermodal. That's probably something, I don't know if we highlighted, maybe Zach, you mentioned it. This is not just moving people. Hyperloop has the opportunity to move cargo and goods. So where if you heard talk or followed a lot of the high-speed rail conversation about cost effectiveness and those kind of things for the billions of dollars that would have to go into this infrastructure investment, Hyperloop has, again, like Zach mentioned, maybe upwards of 20 billion beyond, depending on what it says for a corridor like this. To make it economically feasible, the freight aspect is a major component. And 35 is a major freight corridor, which is why, as Zach mentioned, going into Mexico could be such a huge part of this. And in fact, I don't know, Dan, if you wanted to highlight this point, at least from what I've understood, folks that have looked at high-speed rail between Monterey and Fort Worth, private folks from around the world that operate it, have mentioned that if you simply build, or if you simply, the demand between Monterey and San Antonio could more than pay for the line all the way up to Fort Worth. So from a people aspect, there's demand, especially crossing the border, and then from a cargo standpoint, it's a major component.
And then again, not to go too deep, but the fact that this is a secure technology, because it's totally within a tube, the operator controls whether it stops at intermediate stations. That's the other thing that I don't think we really mentioned enough, that because this is on-demand service, meaning if you're going from Killeen-Temple to San Antonio, you wouldn't have to stop in Austin. You would bypass Austin. There would be tracks available or tubes available to bypass Austin, for example. So because this is a secure technology, it really opens up a whole new discussion on economic development when it comes to freight. Because you can connect Mexico to Killeen-Temple or Waco and still theoretically be in a secured, border-controlled environment and have customs be in Killeen-Temple as it crosses the border, for example. So it really opens up a lot of different possibilities because of the type of facility that this is.
Great question. So based on the presentation, it sounds like this is a private venture. Construction's going to be covered by investments based on future revenue net back. So as far as all the other processes to get us there, environmental, public involvement, right-of-way acquisition, utility relocations, what kind of expectations on the local government and TxDOT are y'all looking at us participating in?
Excellent question. So, and that's really why we're here today. So that's probably a great way to, I know you guys are probably running out of time, and maybe a great way to end it unless there's more questions. But as Zach first said, they're not asking for money from anybody to do their feasibility study. They just need permission to be able to do it because they don't want to do the feasibility study if there's not some potential for longer term support. So because this is an intercity type of facility, it's outside of the North Central Texas jurisdiction. So no matter how bad we want it, we couldn't do it without TxDOT support. TxDOT really is the sponsoring agency, I would say, for this. Now, in the Texas Central, between Houston and Dallas, Amtrak, being a federal agency, quasi-federal agency, is able to be the public sector sponsor. They have jurisdiction over that. TxDOT, as far as I know, is the only jurisdiction, the only place that would have jurisdiction over something that's intercity like this would be TxDOT. So it clearly needs TxDOT support. That's why we're asking all of the MPOs if we can have, Brendon called it an audience with the commission, to explain this situation. Now, I'm sure a lot of people at TxDOT are going to say, you know, we've heard this all, everything's going to be privately funded. We've heard that before, right? We've all heard that before. We've been talking about high-speed rail in Texas for as long as I've been here, more than 30 years. But when it comes down to it, the one from Houston to Dallas is now going to require some level of public support, even though they promised they wouldn't have to go after it. Zach is saying all of his will be privately funded. Now, I can tell you what TransPod, the arrangement that TransPod has and the structure that TransPod has is very deep. This isn't their first, since we're in Central Texas, this isn't their first rodeo. They have done this and they are doing this in Canada already. In fact, part of our certification program, and I know I'm kind of getting strained from your question a little bit, part of the certification program that we identified is the technology provider has to commit, if they build a certification track or center or whatever it is, they have to commit that if for some reason they either don't get certified or it eventually isn't financially feasible to operate the way they wanted it to, they have to commit in writing to converting it into something that is a useful transportation facility for the local government. So I think there are opportunities here, and this is what we want to try to explain to the commission and to Mark and Brian and the other folks in Austin, that this is not only an opportunity to evaluate the most cutting edge technology in the world right now when it comes to transportation, but if it doesn't work out, depending on how far it goes, it can be fully integrated into, I can't imagine we can't figure out something, some kind of transportation facility to include in this corridor, depending on how far it gets. I know TxDOT is recently, thank goodness, near final construction on 35 from Dallas Fort Worth all the way down. But do we all really believe that the extra lane is going to be enough to handle everything in the state for the next several decades? Probably not. So I can't believe that there's not an opportunity to use this as a transportation corridor. That's what we want to try to convince your leadership about. So as of what we need from support right now, from the MPOs like you, we don't need really anything other than your support, other than come with us, help us. I I don't, convincing is probably not the right word, but come with us to support the opportunity that we have here and understanding the risks associated with moving forward. Now in the future, who knows? There may or may not be financial desires as TransPod starts talking about stations. These are not small transit stations. These are stations that look very much like airports. You know, the economic development potential of stations is huge. So partnering with public and private sector on land uses around stations could be very important. So I can't speak to what the ultimate goal is, but I know the immediate goal is TransPod is committed to not asking for any money right now. They know that in order to do anything, they have to have the certification track. They're willing to pay for that on their own dime.
Can I just add?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I'll just add, so we would also commit to not asking for funds during construction or operations. Part of the reason of doing the feasibility study is to confirm that we can be confident that it would be financially feasible. We're pretty sure it would be, thanks to the mix of cargo and passengers, but we need to confirm that. So really one of our key differentiators is we're not going to ask the NPOs or the state government or the federal government to fund this. We're not going to close the door. Like if certain governments would like to provide funding, we'll be open to that. But we're not going to make that a requirement of moving forward on the project. I just want to make sure that's clear.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, Zach. And, you know, I only said what I did, and I fully understand what you're saying. I only said what I did because, like I said, high-speed rail has been talked about in Texas for many years. It's always been promised to be 100% privately financed. And at the end of the day, every proposal comes down to requiring some level of public funding. I understand what you're saying, but people in Texas are a little bit skeptical when we hear things like that. And I fully understand what you're saying, and that's why I mentioned you have a very deep bench when it comes to being able to fund and finance this. And that's why I don't have any hesitation in suggesting that we all move forward with this.
Just to your point about the extra lane that's with TxDOT, if we're honest, we know that is not sufficient for today, to say nothing of years out.
In terms of capacity, power generation, are you guys generating your own electricity, or are you going to be reliant on our grid? And I'll leave the question dangling in the air on the grid.
That's a good question. Zach, do you want to take that?
Yeah, good question. I know that the grid had a lot of trouble, I think, in 2022, but actually I've seen that the grid has been a lot more resilient this year, so that's great. No, we have the option to build solar panels along the top of our infrastructure. Basically, we're building a 700-mile linear infrastructure that's about 30 feet wide. So it's pretty easy to build solar panels on there. And part of the analysis in the study would be to confirm if that's enough to fully power the system or not. My gut is that it probably won't be, but I'm not 100% sure. And so I would say it would probably be maybe about up to 50% powered by what we can generate and up to 50% grid powered. But again, that's just sort of a guess. The general overall structure, though, would be to have a grid connection, but also be able to generate our own power.
Thank you, sir.
One more technical. I don't know if it's too soon to ask this, but as you decide what area, I guess the municipality's got to figure out we have space so that as we go through our zoning process, we don't set things up that knocks us out of it. What's the general size of the facility that will be needed?
Zach, what's the width of the corridor that you would need to pipes?
It's about 30 feet. I'm trying to do the math between meters and feet off on the top of my head because I'm used to saying meters, but each tube is 4 meters in diameter, and so that's about I think 12 feet. And so for 2 tubes, we need 25 to 30 feet total.
So
That
maybe
includes,
it's
what about the
right
So,
away,
yeah.
maybe.
Yeah. Now, it will be slightly wider, as you saw from Zach's diagram. As you get into a station and you want to have multiple bays to be able to have different pods go into, stations would have to be a little bit wider. And then if you do have to go into tunnels, for example, those portals may have to be a little bit wider as well. And the other thing that we need to keep in mind is because these are potentially mostly elevated, you also have to have escape routes for people to get out if something happens, if they get stuck. But because this is elevated, really the majority of the right-of-way width is the columns and the structure you need to support the tubes. And then you just have to provide a mechanism for them to get from the tube level to ground level if something happened periodically.
And I would add that from our experience on doing high-speed rail planning between Fort Worth and Dallas, very similar footprint that we've been thinking if we're elevated. If you're within a public right-of-way situation, for instance, if you're along a freeway between the main lane and the frontage road on the outside, you may be able to, part of your right-of-way of the facility maybe can join with public right-of-way in that sense. The footprint would be relatively small. If it's in green space, then maybe they would need, beyond that 30 feet, a little bit, their set right-of-way, maybe a utility path along there to be able to maintain the facility, those kind of things. But it's a little bit dependent on where it is located in the actual footprint.
Yeah, and to give you just to carry this out a little further, the footprint for high-speed rail and the footprint for Hyperloop are about the same. That's why in our study, we're not worried about whether we're doing Hyperloop or high-speed rail, because the footprint is about the same. You just have to make sure that you're able to provide the requirements. But to carry on what Brendon said just a little bit more, we actually, in our study for our Dallas to Fort Worth, we actually have drawn up a few examples where we've cantilevered. Like if we're in a trench, you can cantilever freeway main lanes or frontage roads over these trenches. Or if they're elevated, the elevated structure can be cantilevered over the top of the freeway lane. Right? It all just comes down to then how do you engineer it and make sure that it works right. So it's not as much as, say, a surface rail would be. If you're running class 1 railroads, you don't need the larger right-of-way widths to be able to handle it.
So if we wanted, say the policy board wanted to show support for a feasibility study or certification track, do we just need a resolution of support? Or are you asking for elected officials to go to the commission with, maybe a couple of your policy board members and from all the regions? And what does that look like? What do you actually need? I can sit here all day and say, well, I think they'll support it, but I'm sure there has to be something other than just I think so, to submit. Is that a resolution? And then can we piggyback the same certification process you have, or do we need to reinvent the wheel down here, or just?
Well, I think a lot of that particular question, I think we'll have to get answered by the state and see what they're going to require, right? As far as I'm concerned, I don't think we need you to piggyback on our certification process. But the state may ask you to, I don't know. I think what we would eventually be asking for, and I don't think I can answer your question directly right now about do we need a resolution. A resolution certainly wouldn't hurt. Now, I notice it's not listed as an action item on your agenda today, but a resolution certainly wouldn't hurt at some point. Now, whether we ask just you or you and your chairman to come down and speak, we'll have to talk about it. You're the first MPO we're visiting right now to go over all this. A lot of it's going to depend on what kind of meeting we're able to set up. If it's only with TxDOT staff, leadership staff, Mark, Brian, something like that, then we probably just need you to come with us and be able to say, yes, my board is fully behind it. But if we do have a meeting and we are able to get something with the commission, one or two of your members may be worth coming down here.
Gotcha.
But we haven't gone that far yet. We're just trying to gauge, is everybody still interested in this? And now we've taken up a lot of your time, and I really appreciate it.
Anything else? I don't have anything. If anybody does have questions, of course, your contact information is in here. You can reach out to staff. We can always get a hold of the folks with TransPod or North Central for any additional clarification. I'm sure these conversations will continue in the coming months, just so we can all stay on track.
Yeah, and it occurred to me as Zach was going through his presentation, there's a lot of really cool sounding things he's got in there. And if you start explaining this to people at cocktail parties, they're going to roll their eyes and look at you like, really? But I hope Zach was able to convince you. This is a technology, it's available today. Everything they're doing has been proven. It's just putting it all together to make it work as one system. So talk it up. Tell your friends about it. Get some excitement. Thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dan, Brandon, Zach, we really do appreciate the time that y'all took this morning. And I personally am thrilled to be reminded that the fourth state of matter is plasma. If you didn't get anything out of that,
Yeah, Zach made it sound like, of course, we all remember
is
the
plasma propulsion.
Thanks, everybody.